In a remote area in Montana, houses were separated by miles instead of yards or feet. There was a town with only a few things to keep it running: a gas station, a dozen or so locally owned hardware and general stores, along with a single diner and a hospital to boot, though the nurses and doctors were almost exclusively all from the next town over. A few miles away from the town's center was a log cabin with only the most basic modern amenities, inhabited by the local Chris, a man in his mid-30s. His eyes were glazed over while watching the old box TV. He was flipping through channels, an old western his dad had watched countless times, some kid's cartoon he didn't recognize or care about, a news report about a missing child in Colorado. As he sipped more of his home-brewed coffee, his hound dog, Buddy, lazily walked up to him, nudging his remote hand with its nose. The coldness of it shocking Chris's hand slightly, bringing him out of his autopilot. He looked at his dog, the canine looking older than it really was, given all the wrinkles and folds natural to its breed. Chris laid his remote on the arm of the chair and gave his dog a half-hearted ear massage. The dog groaned slightly, leaning its head into the pressure of his fingers. The sun began to peek out from the mountains in the distance, light streaking across the land and to the cabin. Chris, now aware of the time, finally stood up, putting his winter boots on and his jacket. His annual woodland excursion was approaching, and he needed supplies. Stepping outside into the snowy yard, the cold air gave his lungs a mild shock, fully waking him up. Buddy jumped up into the passenger seat as Chris hoisted himself into the driver's side. With a few turns of the engine and a quick second of worry that it wouldn't start, the old bastard of a vehicle finally hummed to life. Chris was blasted with cold air from the vents he forgot to turn off last time he was in the truck. Shivering from the sudden rush of cold air, he let himself recover from it. He shifted into gear and got out of his driveway, tires sliding in the smooth, packed-in snow till he hit the salted main road. It was a silent and empty drive to the local gas station. The road was empty, the fields plowed some months ago, leaving the morning sky unobstructed. Orange and yellow bands encircled the horizon. Steve's gas station was the center of activity. It had an official name, some corporate chain, but it was Steve's place once you lived there long enough. A respectably sized establishment, always a few semi-trucks parked there. Either interstate drivers or locals stopping in for their daily caffeine hit. It had a lounge that acted as the community meet on more than one occasion. Lots of Christmas parties and Halloween costume contests. The only thing they didn't celebrate there was the 4th of July. If it wasn't happening at Steve's, it probably wasn't happening at all. Chris pulled up to the building. Buddy stayed put.
"Chris, my boy,"
Steve greeted one of his favorite regulars.
"It's that time of year again. Another winter vacation. 6 years and going, right?"
"It's a survival exercise," Chris replied. "And it's the 7th year." Steve smirked at him while he counted some cash from a previous transaction.
"You know, you better be glad you got a boss that lets you do this stuff."
Chris was looking down at some snack foods while keeping the banner going. "It's the off-season, Steve. Besides, he thinks it's good for people to get back to nature."
"All we're gonna have when the government decides it doesn't want us anymore." You know, he's crazy. But he's also probably right. That reminds me. You remember Michael, my cousin?
Yeah? Chris answered from an aisle.
Well, it seems your escapades rubbed off on him. He started doing that survival stuff too last year. I think he's out there right now. Same place you're going, I believe. Tell him I said hi if you see him. Oh, almost forgot.
He cut himself off from his activity.
Speaking of survival, I remembered to save you some MREs. You know, after you asked me to get some for you last year, I bought a whole pallet of them, just to test them. Suckers flew off the shelf.
Steve nodded to himself in approval of his financial genius.
As it turns out, truckers prefer not having to squeeze their rigs through McDonald's parking lots.
You're welcome, Chris responded with a smirk. Steve finished putting the cash into his register before continuing.
You know, since it's lucky number 7, and you inspired a best-selling item, and since you ran out of gas that one year, fill your truck on the house.
Chris was surprised a bit. In this economy?
Just don't go advertising it. I didn't bring enough for everyone.
Chris brought up 2 basketfuls of various items, both food and some last additions to his camping gear. Steve scanned the MREs he had held onto for this trip. As Chris grabbed the bags of his items and headed for the door, Steve called out to him.
Hey, almost forgot to tell you. Some hunters came by a day or 2 ago. Said they're seeing some real nasty stuff out there. A few mountain lions and deer shredded up, if you can believe that. They're thinking the bears are desperate this year. Just keep your eyes open.
Chris nodded, then went to his truck. He took up Steve on his generosity and filled his truck before heading to his last stop, the gun store. He always took his shotgun with him, but this time he wanted to get some slug rounds and something a little more extravagant with the money he saved on gas. Once there, the gun shop owner also warned Chris about the severity of animal mutilation seen by some of the hunters in the area. It wouldn't be the first time he had to kill something wild and dangerous out there, though it did make him second guess taking his dog with him. Granted, he'd rather have the better set of ears and nose with him than not. It was about 11 a.m. when Chris pulled up to the entrance of the forest. It wasn't an official camping ground, but everyone used it for that anyways. Experienced survivalists liked to use it, saying that they didn't have to travel far to feel cut off from civilization. Chris loaded up his camping backpack, which could hold a lot of the big stuff, then a duffel bag in his left hand, containing the rest. With his shotgun in his right hand and Buddy to his left, he set off down a half-worn trail. Within 40 to 50 feet, the tree density had made it nearly impossible to see the truck when looking back. The white snow reflecting the bright noon sun and the evergreens spanning in all directions. It made for a scenic trek through the wilderness. An occasional breeze helped to remind Chris that this was no summer vacation. Once night came, it'd be a different environment. A few bird species that stayed, even in the cold, sang out their tunes. A dead branch snapping and falling from the weight of the snow, encouraged by occasional winds, would grab Chris's attention. But overall, it was a peaceful walk. Buddy indulged in his usual sniffing campaign, checking every hole he found, finding animal droppings in the snow, marking his territory, and so on. Their trek was paused by the sounds of a mountain lion screeching off in the distance. The reverberation off the sides of the valley made it nearly impossible to tell how far away or what direction it came from. Chris chambered around into his shotgun. He knew the large cat would probably keep its distance, but now that he knew one was active, he wanted to be prepared. Once the sounds of the animal had died down, he continued on his path. The light was just beginning to dim. The sky was starting to adopt the usual colors of dusk. Chris found a relatively spacious area and began setting up his camp for the coming week. His tent was a simple A-frame with a waterproof outer layer. He preferred to keep it simple, gave him more time to get the fire going. He always tried the hard way first, rubbing sticks together. However, the wind had begun to pick up, not allowing any kindling to stay put while attempting a primitive fire-starting approach, forcing him to use the modern solution, a cigarette lighter. Within minutes, he had a respectable fire going, surrounded by some stones he had found to keep it from spreading. Granted, everything had a coating of snow, but he'd rather not be responsible for a forest fire. After the work of setting up camp, he opened up one of the MREs, choosing to use its built-in heating element rather than waiting on the fire to cook it. While Chris waited for the food to heat, he went around the immediate area, spraying some of the trees and ground with a scent masker. Ever since his second outdoor excursion, having to deal with a bear orbiting his camp for several days, he chose to remove that stress from future survival expeditions. The rest of the night was spent going over his supplies and working with his shotgun, keeping his feel for it fresh in his mind, and comforting his dog. The first morning, second day of his survival week, Chris wanted to try and catch something to eat rather than using his rations again. The air was as cold as it was clear. The sun peeked over the mountains, just barely, casting light through the misty tops. The shadow of the mountain could be seen for miles. Despite the bitingly low temperature, Chris knew by the time he would head back to camp, the sun would be fully exposed and heating his back, taking the chill off of him. He once again loaded his shotgun and encouraged Buddy to get up, despite the dog's reluctant demeanor that morning. Even with his coat of fur, the warmth of the tent was a hard thing to give up. Finally, Buddy stirred and rose from the ground. Chris fed him a palm-sized cut of meat to get Buddy a little more energetic, which did the trick. They began walking north, marking trees with a plastic orange ribbon every 30 feet or so. The trees were too densely packed to allow for farther spacing. Some 2 miles were navigated before something caught Chris's eye. A boulder to the right of the imaginary path he was taking. Several bright lines on it. Upon further inspection, they were claw marks, and on the ground only a few inches away were the broken remains of the claws that left the marks. He couldn't be totally sure. They seemed to be a pattern a cougar would leave, maybe the one they had heard the day before. Why would it scratch the rock hard enough to break its own claws? Chris thought to himself. Maybe it was attacked. Maybe it was dragged away, trying to hold on to whatever it could. Steve and the gun shop owners must have been right. The bears were desperate this year, he reasoned. Another half-mile of walking came and went before the first kill of the day. Buddy had chased a rabbit some ways before finally catching it. Chris took it out of Buddy's mouth, breaking the creature's neck as quickly as he could, not wanting to let it suffer more than it had to. The same process happened 2 more times before it was time to head back. The sun had been shining over the mountains for nearly an hour by this point. Once again, the snow was nearly blinding in its reflection. However, a different color began to enter Chris's eyes. A color that wasn't supposed to be there. Red covered the ground around a tree. Only adjusting his vision a few degrees up showed the source. A skinned animal hanging from a branch. Soon, he realized it was a cougar, or what was left of one. At first, the sight didn't fully register. He had butchered his fair share of deer and boar. This was a typical procedure for that. But then it began to occur to him. This wasn't here when I first came through. Its blood is still wet. Someone did this less than an hour ago. No one else is out here. Bears don't hang their food. The feeling one gets when they know something isn't right. The feeling that something should happen now that you're aware of it. Chris was becoming overwhelmed by these sensations. His grip on his shotgun tightened. He now regretted not loading the buckshot or slug rounds he brought with him. The ammo in the tube right now was birdshot, and he knew that was no match for the larger beasts in these woods, or whatever was strong enough to lift a mountain lion onto a branch 20 feet in the air. And something else entered his consciousness. There were no birds, no fluttering of wings. There was not a single breeze. His senses heightened. His ears were listening for any sound they could hear. His eyes were looking for any detail they could see. His nose was monitoring for any smell he could pick up on. Chris was still, fearing that moving even an inch would set off whatever might be watching him. His fight-or-flight response was going into overdrive. He pressed the safety off on his shotgun, getting ready to react to anything that might move against him. He prepared to throw the rabbit carcasses from his left hand and use it to aim his firearm. Chris suddenly took one step forward, then erratically looked around him, searching for any movement in the dense trees, trying to look for any shapes heading for him. There was nothing. Once he was sure he was alone, his heart rate began to calm. But his concern of the situation was not fully alleviated. But he showed no signs of alertness, which let him know things were probably safe. Chris wasted no time getting back to camp. Once there, he put the rabbits down, ejecting the shells from his shotgun and replacing them with stronger ammunition. He waited for several minutes, seeing if something wanted to use this moment to attack. Once again, nothing. A moment of relaxation was warranted to calm his mind and steady his hand. Chris put his gun down somewhere close and took his hunting knife from its sheath. He began skinning the rabbits, keeping his focus split between prepping his food and keeping an eye out for something worse. Finally, after around 45 minutes and a measured pace, rabbits were skinned, siphoned of what meat they had, and started on the fire. Chris didn't leave his campsite for the rest of the day. Whoever, or at least whatever was out there, he didn't want his camp unattended. Then Chris remembered what Steve had said about his cousin Michael being out there. For a few seconds, that explanation satisfied him. Then he began to second-guess his logic. Why would he hang the mountain lion there? Why wouldn't he let Chris know he was around that close? How would he have hung it up that high with no rope? These questions gnawed at his mind. Chris threw a few pieces of meat to Buddy, letting the dog have the reward he worked for earlier that day. While he kept reminding himself of the repellent he set up around the camp, the aroma of cooked meat could be enough for a starving animal, namely bears, to overcome the scent barrier. Right now, he was fine. He let his nerves calm down more. In the coming hours, he would make an effort to remove the aroma of cooked meat from the immediate area. Unfortunately, he knew whoever was skinning mountain lion like that wouldn't be so easily fooled. Of course, it could have just been another hunter he hadn't seen while out there. No gunshots that would indicate a firearm. Maybe a bow hunter. Completely normal for this area, given potential avalanches from using a rifle. But why wouldn't they be there, safeguarding their kill from predators? Chris once again sowed doubt into his own theories. This was the one drawback of being out in the quiet wilderness like this. Too much time to think. He came to the decision not to light fires anymore. The MREs he had would be the safest option to keep his presence low. While Chris had heard of a strange mountain men still wandering the forest, there were never reports of violent encounters, if the tales of modern-day wild men were even true to begin with. A bow hunter still couldn't be ruled out, that or Michael, and they were most likely the sanest answers. Simple explanation. A hunter I didn't see on my way in killed the mountain lion, then hung it up so nothing else could get to it, Chris explained to his own mind, attempting to ease his tension. It wouldn't be the first time something strange had happened out there, and he'd be damned if he cut his adventure short because of a dead animal. However, there was one thing still bugging him about the cougar. Its hind legs were wedged into a forking tree branch. How did a hunter climb up that high with such a heavy body in tow? Why not just drag it back to their camp? With a much more steady heart rate, Chris got up to start masking the scent he created. After doubling the repellent, he worked up the courage to check the spot the cougar had been butchered. He grabbed his gun and called for Buddy to accompany him. It was a measured trek back to the site. Chris didn't want to admit it, but there was a growing anxiety in his stomach. When he arrived at the spot, he discovered something that he wasn't sure should either relieve him or make him even more worried. The carcass was gone. The only thing that let him know this was the right spot was the blood left over. He didn't have much time to guess where the carcass had gone before something caught his attention in full. A smell quickly entered his nose, one of pure rot. It hit him like an avalanche, so much so his mind went into full panic. He lost all sense of logic. All Chris could think about was blocking the smell. Buddy was even more affected, given the canine's superior sense of smell. The dog ran off, running in a direction opposite the camp. Chris attempted to grab at him, but fell to the ground, causing him to lose his breath and take another one, filling his lungs with the rancid odor that encased the woods. Chris reluctantly had to stumble back to camp, leaving Buddy out in the woods while he collected himself. He stuck his head in the smoke of the fire, breathing in anything that didn't reek of decomposing meat. Now with air in his lungs that didn't burn his senses, he could think clearly. However, his clearer mind was once again interrupted. A shriek of an animal rang out. Not Buddy's, but still a cry of panic nonetheless. Chris called out to Buddy, waiting a few seconds, but not hearing or seeing any signs of his dog. Another cry from an unknown animal set Chris's stomach on fire. His companion was still out there, possibly being attacked or attacking something that could kill him. Grabbing his shotgun again, Chris ran out into the woods, towards the sound. The odor of death had subsided, but Payne's screams rang out every few seconds. Chris called for his dog again and again, but no results came. By this point, the sun began to set, and in his scramble, he had forgotten to take a flashlight with him. Chris aimed his gun at a tree in the distance and fired, hoping the sound would interrupt whatever was happening in the distance. The percussion from the 12-gauge echoed off the mountains. There was silence for a moment, which either meant his distraction worked, or whatever was causing the sound was dead. Finally, he reached the area he heard the cries come from. Like before, it was a grisly scene. Blood, viscera drenching the snow. The worst came to his mind. Buddy. As Chris observed the scene, he began to realize there was far too much blood for it to be from a dog of Buddy's size. Then he spotted it. A patch of fur that confirmed it wasn't canine, but it also left him with a heart-racing dawning. The fur was from a bear. He was sharing the woods with something that tore a bear apart, leaving nothing left but a plot of blood and tissue. The food chain, which had already been working against Chris, had shifted again. He now occupied a lower rank than when he came into the woods a day ago. As this realization came, the hairs on his arms stood up. The biggest chills he had ever felt shot up his spine in waves. Then he heard the crunching of snow behind him. Chris whipped around, pointing his shotgun at whatever was approaching him. It was Buddy, his tail tucked firmly between his legs as he sprinted up to his owner. Chris quickly lowered his rifle, then noticed Buddy's frightened state, making him raise his rifle again into the distance. He waited for something to show itself while Buddy circled him closely. Chris stood at the ready for about 5 minutes, his finger lightly tapping the trigger from the adrenaline. Once it seemed like nothing was coming, he finally looked down to his dog, looking him over, checking for any kind of injuries. The canine was clean, no damage, but the question remained. What spooked him that badly in the first place? Buddy had seen all manner of beasts out there. Raging buck, territorial moose, screeching mountain lion, even charging bears. Buddy braved them all, showing an idiotic courage more than an intelligent fear. Chris grabbed Buddy's collar and ran with him back to camp. Once there, he found as much firewood as he could get and started a blazing inferno. To hell with concealment, he thought. Whatever was out there in the lowering sun, he wanted to see it coming from a mile away. Chris got his ammo in an easily accessible area. Buddy was now on a makeshift twine leash tied to Chris's waist. The wait was nerve-wracking, checking every direction multiple times every second for an hour. At this point, Chris wanted to see something, anything, so that he could put an end to it and enjoy his getaway. The constant anxiety was wearing on him. His eyes were getting heavy as the fire slowly grew dim in the passing time. Chris woke himself, his mind fighting sleep, remembering the danger in the woods. The sun had long since left the world, and the dark crept in around the campsite. The once towering inferno he had set was a few shortened flames attempting to fight the shadows. For a moment, it was calm. He didn't know how long he had been out. Buddy was laying next to him in a more upright position dogs do when they don't expect to sleep long. Whatever fog was left in his mind from the short sleep was quickly dissipated by a distinct snapping of a tree branch in a distance in the woods. Chris shot up immediately. The fire had died down too much to see beyond 15 feet. He budged a smoldering branch within the bonfire, allowing it to collapse and spark up. A sizable flame grew for a moment, enough to let him catch a glimpse of what was in the woods. A quick sight of antlers before the fire returned to a dimmer state. Relief washed over him. It was a deer. Doubtful it was what caused the cries earlier, but at least he wasn't in immediate danger. Until it dawned on him. He didn't see any reflection from its eyes. Even now, he couldn't see them. Then he remembered how far up the antlers were. They were sitting on a skull that was far too tall for the average deer in that area. Was it a moose? Chris attempted to reason, trying to understand the sight he had seen. Before logic could attempt to help, another snap rang out, now closer. He couldn't decide whether to throw another load of branches on the fire or release another shotgun blast into the air. Buddy began to growl viciously. Another branch broken. Another distance closed. His window for action was closing. Whatever was stalking him drew near. Without the fire, he couldn't see as much as he needed to aim. Without the gun, he couldn't defend himself long enough to get the fire bigger. The last twig snapping before Chris figured out his plan. He quickly found an unburned portion of a branch and grabbed it, lifting it out of the fire, then throwing it towards the sound. As the makeshift torch flew through the air, he spun around, grabbing his shotgun, and hearing the thud of the branch landing. Chris turned back quickly, nearly losing his balance, fearing that whatever was coming had closed the distance in that short time. He aimed in the area the branch had landed. Like every time before, there was nothing there. Nothing the fire was illuminating, at least. He wanted to be relieved that there was nothing coming after him, but he also wanted to see what was stalking him. Buddy turned his head, looking behind them, then announced with another low and intense growl. Chris knew that sound, a sound Buddy only made when something was close and dangerous. A chill went up his spine. Goosebumps covered every inch of his skin. Chris turned around, slowly, hesitant to even see what was behind him. As he fully turned, the woods behind him seemed to be just as empty as the rest of what he had seen. But it was within his shadow, being cast by the fire behind him, where he saw faint movement. Footsteps could be felt, slowly approaching. Twigs were snapping, and branches were being pushed out of the way. Out of his shadow, something tall finally exited the trees. The closer it got, the more that was illuminated by the fire. Chris couldn't find his breath, too afraid to move, hoping that somehow this creature wouldn't notice him, despite standing in front of it. If he could have stopped his heart, he would have. Finally, the beast was visible. It stood some 7 feet tall. Its hunched back and double-jointed legs only suggested a higher stance. Its limbs were long and thin, with patchy fur attempting to cover it, but decay and rot disrupted the skin. The feet were like massive hooves. The chest was larger than its waist, though the innards were exposed. The ribs and lungs within could be seen in windows of the flesh. The hands of this monstrosity were nearly human, but longer, with fingers to complement. Skewers seemed to be what this thing had for nails, but there was no clear point where the skin ended and the nail began. It was the head that finally complemented the visage of this monstrosity. A bare skull of a deer, but with eyes wet and fleshy. Large antlers sprouted from the skull, dark red patches littering them. The base of the skull was attached to the flesh of the neck somehow. A few vertebrae could be seen jutting out from the skin. Movement from the beast's clawed hands drew Chris's attention. There were small puddles of fresh blood dripping onto the snow. A thought flashed in his mind, explaining why it was showing itself, why it hadn't just attacked him. It knows I can't escape. Then, the most important impulse finally came. Shoot. Chris didn't even attempt to shoulder his firearm. He simply moved his arm enough to point a shotgun in its general direction and fired. The shot rang out, the recoil snapping him out of his stupor. Body jolted backwards as Chris pumped out the empty shell and chambered a new one. Whether he hit the creature or not didn't matter. It was now coming at him. This time, he put the shotgun to his shoulder, aiming down the sights as much as his adrenaline would let him. He let loose another round. This time, he was sure it made contact, but the beast still came. It wound up its right arm, pulled back, and swung at Chris, though its labored movements allowed him to fall backward, avoiding the claws. The swipe hit his tent, collapsing it. Once again charging his gun, he rolled over and aimed in front of him, putting another direct load of buckshot into this thing. This time, the shot seemed to do something. The impact seemed to throw the creature off balance, tipping it face first into the fire. Chris got to his feet in a panic. Buddy was tugging at him for the makeshift leash. He watched as this thing writhed in the fire. He took this chance to grab as many shells from the boxes of ammo that he could and stuff in his pockets, as well as loading more into his gun. There was no question. He had to get out of there. Chris ducked into the woods with Buddy in the direction of his truck. He found a large tree to get behind while finishing loading more shells into the tube of his shotgun. After loading the last round it could handle, chambering it, then topping it off again, he peeked out from the tree. The beast had rolled itself out of the fire, pushing itself back up. There were still flames dancing on its skin, burning off what little fur it had left. The thing took in a slow and deep breath. It was like he could feel the air around him being pulled towards it, rushing by him. Its lungs overexpanded. The thin membrane of the organs were pressing against the exposed ribs. They inflated beyond the bones in the chest. The creature straightened its body up, its full height being realized. It was easily 9 feet tall, maybe 10. It released a sound from its flapping throat, a hollow, echoing voice that bounced off every tree, making it surround Chris. It was almost deafening. He covered his ears as he winced from it. Buddy showed obvious signs of pain, to which Chris sacrificed his own limited comfort to hold Buddy's ears shut instead. It lasted several seconds, but the pain dragged it out. It was the next part that hit him with realization. The stench that traveled into his nose. It was the rancid, nose and eye burning odor he had smelled earlier that day. Then it came to him. The sound was a rally call. The smell is a defense mechanism. Chris picked up a branch near him and threw it as hard as he could, high up to his right, getting it above the trees. He could hear it falling through the branches some ways off. The beast ran in that direction. With the distraction in place, Chris bolted through the woods. He kept Buddy close, trying to avoid him going in a different path, inevitably getting the twine snagged on a small tree or tangled in a bush. He made it nearly 300 feet before his lungs were burning too much to continue his sprint. Ducking behind another tree, he tried to listen to his surroundings through the sound of his heart blasting in his head. Over the sound of the beating drum in his ears, there was nothing. It was only once he had let even a drop of relief come in that he heard the sound of something cutting through the air. Within a split second, he ducked out of the way as the massive clawed hand swiped down on him, nicking his left arm and cutting the twine leash. Buddy shot away from the situation. Just as the creature was about to slam its claws into Chris's abdomen, he fired into it, causing it to flinch, missing his body, but still leaving a gash on his side. The beast tore its daggers from the dirt. Chris unloaded another round into it. This time, the steel balls puncturing its exposed lungs, shredding them. The creature staggered back. It held its ribs, the thick, clotted blood seeping between its fingers and the rotted holes in its hand. It then turned its head in the direction Buddy ran off to. The creature's body slowly turned, and in a wobbling motion, began to walk away from Chris. He knew what it was doing. He was too much hassle for it to deal with, but the dog was far more easy. Chris tried to get up, but the pain irradiating from his arm and abdomen was giving him pause. He could barely move from his position. Chris loaded another shell. Then, as steady as he could make himself, he fired. Several of the buckshot missed, hitting the trees and dirt. Few made impact, but did not seem to affect the beast. The shot had laid him out. He couldn't manage to even pump another round. The throbbing right rib, he eased himself up, trying to see through the trees, but he had lost sight of the monster. He didn't hear any yelps from Buddy, so either it hadn't found his dog yet, or it killed him too fast to react. Slowly, Chris got onto his feet, made his way back to his camp, keeping in mind what direction Buddy and the creature went. The soft jolt of his right foot hitting the ground was sending quick waves of pain into his ribs. The distance from him to his camp was relatively short if he was able to walk at a decent pace. With the constant reminder of the pain, his trek was much longer. Finally, Chris made it back to his deflated camp. The fire was still raging, but his tent was collapsed. He pulled the nylon fabric sheet off the ground. He rifled through the scattered equipment, finding the limited first aid he brought. Dousing the wound in rubbing alcohol, sending him through a whirlwind of pain, but also clearing his head. He decided to do the bare minimum of bandaging. He needed to get out of there, to find his dog. He used all the gauze and tape he had to cover his gashes. It was then that he found the box of ammo he had finally decided to buy from the gun shop this time. Dragon's breath. Using them in an area like this was dubious at best, but now that he was up against something far beyond what he knew, he needed all the help he could get. Opening up the box, he packed as many of the shells as he could fit in his pockets. Even if they weren't the most deadly rounds he had, they could be used to blind it or catch it on fire. Given the rotted skin of the beast, some of the magnesium could get stuck in the flesh and do damage. The shotgun could handle 7 rounds, plus 1 in the chamber. First, loading a slug round, then incendiary, and then alternating them. Loading a breath round into the chamber, then putting the last slug round into the tube, he was set. Chris took a full breath, the pain of his abdomen hitting him. He grabbed a branch from the bonfire and headed off in the direction of the creature. His side still burned from the walking, but he gritted his teeth and continued. He wouldn't leave his pet to the mercy of that beast. He was some ways away from the camp when suddenly ear-piercing cracks rang out. Gunshots, then yelling, and silence. Someone else was out there with him. For a moment, he was elated to have some backup. Then it occurred to him that the yell was cut off. Whoever it was, they probably ran into the same thing he was dealing with. They probably weren't as lucky just now. The new surge of adrenaline masked the pain of walking, allowing him to get to the source of the yelling faster. The monster was nowhere in sight. But one thing was, and it threw Chris into sheer terror. There was a human body on the ground in front of him, torn to shreds. Despite the gashes on the man's face, the blood drenching it as well, Chris recognized who it was. Michael, Steve's cousin. It began to dawn on him, a sequence of events. All the shots Chris fired at that thing. Michael must have heard it, along with the rally call of the beast. He came to investigate what was going on. Then it attacked. The same odor the creature had given off earlier was pervading the scene. There was no doubt it caused this. Chris was frozen. He was almost lightheaded from the scene. He had survived his encounter. It didn't fully register with him just how dangerous this thing could be. But now, a man lying dead in front of him brought it to the front. For a brief moment, he considered running as fast as his injuries would allow him, to get out of the woods, if he even could, abandon his dog. It was the thought of his companion, alone, out in the dark, searching for his owner, afraid, completely outmatched, that halted his cowardice. No, he wouldn't allow it. There was a wash of stillness over his body. The shaking from the anxiety was gone. He could no longer feel the cold around him. The clouds shifted, allowing the moon to illuminate his surroundings. There were large hoof prints leading further north of Michael's body. Chris's grip on his weapon tightened back up. He began walking the direction of the prints, his injuries no longer impeding his steps. He followed the tracks for several minutes, He was on the right path. Given the broken branches and toppled bushes this thing was leaving in its wake. It was the sound of heavy footsteps that gave him pause. The creature was a short distance in front of him, but it didn't seem to notice his presence. It sniffed at the air, searching the ground, no doubt looking for Buddy. Chris slowly crouched down, making his figure less visible. Creeping behind a nearby intact bush, he improvised a very quick plan. Once he was in the right position, Chris found a decent-sized stick and threw it back the way he came. Just as he wanted, the monster's attention was caught. It slowly began walking towards him, still lumbering from the damage he had inflicted. It slowly walked through the tight clearing Chris was sitting in. As it passed, that's when he saw something. The glint of metal caught the moonlight. His eyes strained to focus on it. He could see Buddy's collar and name tag hanging from one of its claws. Fear was coursing through his veins. But in that moment, anger enveloped his bones. At that second, all he wanted was for this abomination to be dead. The creature turned its head at the sound of rustling to its left. Its eyes discovered the end of a barrel pointed right at it. Click. A blinding ball of fire engulfed the monster's head, the magnesium in the incendiary shot embedding into the rotten flesh. It stumbled back, falling to the ground. The thing let out muffled howls as the burning metal seared into its skull, its ruptured lungs not allowing it to call out as loud, though how it was making any sound was beyond his understanding, nor was he concerned with it. Chris racked the pump action, firing the slug round into its abdomen, exploding flesh and bone, sending viscera into the air. Another pump, this time firing more dragon's breath into the beast, specifically into its exposed chest cavity. A considerable amount of its chest was blown away from the fireball. The remaining flesh was burning away. At this point, it was now just a splintered rib cage and a spine holding the middle section of this creature together. The next round would finally finish it. The slug round was chambered. Chris aimed at the vertebrae and let loose. The bone shattered. What little semblance of an actual spinal cord was splattered onto the ground. The beast was now in two. Chris looked over his work. While the creature seemed to defy biology he knew, splitting it in half seemed to do the trick anyways. He heard snow crunching to his right. His head shot over to the source, his gun at the ready. To his absolute relief, Buddy trotted up to him. He knelt down to his dog, rubbing his neck, wrapping his left arm around the canine. A sound to his left refocused his attention. The beast was still alive, trying to pull itself along the ground. Chris was dumbfounded. Buddy whimpered. Chris unloaded the rounds in his shotgun, replacing them with the buckshot. He stepped over the upper half of the crawling monster. First, he shot the hands, disabling them permanently. Chris then grabbed the beast by the antlers, cranking its head back. He placed the barrel of his gun up to the back of its neck and used the shot to detach its head from the torso. The abomination finally lay dead. Chris called for his dog to follow him. He moved as fast as he could, the pain from his injuries beginning to rear their effects again, now that the immediate danger was over. He remembered the rally call the beast had made earlier. He didn't want to be present when whatever else showed up. He passed by his camp. The fire was practically dead by now. Thankfully, the moon was still out. Chris left his gear there. He couldn't carry any more than a shotgun and the head of the creature he had brought with him. He was nearly to his truck. The journey, while relatively short, made all the more arduous by his wounds. His movement was halted by the thuds and branches snapping all around him. The moonlight was choked out by clouds once again. His eyes attempted to adjust to the sudden darkness now pervading the forest. It almost felt unnatural how lightless it was. Chris simply could not see further than the tree line in the claustrophobic opening he found himself in. Then, he saw them. Multiple pairs of glowing eyes surrounding him. They were too tall to be anything other than more of what he had just faced. The sounds of their deep, ragged breathing indicating just how close they were. Buddy wrapped his body around Chris as well as he could, tail firmly tucked between his hind legs. There was a moment of pause. Chris was completely frozen, once again feeling like any movement from him would evoke an attack. The sensation on his fingers from the antlers he was holding broke through. He remembered the severed head he was holding. Chris raised the head of the beast he had killed. He held it there, hoping it would send a message. It did. The glowing points in the dark faded back into the shadows. It was like a veil had been lifted. Despite the moon still being obstructed by the clouds, he was able to see past the trees he previously was imprisoned by. With his path clear, he ignored the pain in his body and ran. The glint from the truck's headlight housing and what was left of the moonlight caught his eye through the dense trees, and with it, a surge of adrenaline gave Chris another burst of energy, allowing him to sprint the final distance, Buddy easily keeping pace. Chris slammed up against the truck, dropping the head of the beast and ripping the driver's side door open, getting Buddy to jump in. He tossed his shotgun into the truck and hoisted himself up. His hands shook as he yanked his keys out of his pocket and attempting to stick them in the ignition slot. Every miss felt like it took minutes more to retry. Once in, he cranked the key to the right. The engine whined, and the familiar rumble of the truck roared to life. Chris wanted to be relieved that he was getting out of those woods, but his haste was not slowed. Not until something in the corner of his vision caught his attention. The severed head was dissolving. It was melting into a puddle of black liquid that eventually dissipated completely. Only the antlers were left. He focused on it for a moment, unsure of what he was seeing. A whine from Buddy snapped him out of it. Chris sped off down the makeshift road he had come in on. His pounding heart kept his mind focused. Not an ounce of sleep was going to touch him while he raged through the road. Every curve he had to slow down on felt like he was becoming a sitting duck. The high beams of his truck casting shadows from the trees, constantly tricking his mind into thinking those abominations were surrounding him again. Once the half-formed dirt path led out to a paved road, albeit still removed from civilization, Chris allowed relief to seep in, even if he was still out in the sticks. That modicum of human craftsmanship let him know he was closer to salvation. Now on a proper road, he cranked up the speed of his truck, pushing it faster than he ever had. As the lights from the nearby towns started to become visible, the exhaustion from the adrenaline began to show. Soon after getting into town, Chris pulled into the hospital parking lot near the emergency room. He left Buddy in the truck with plans to have a friend come and pick him up once he got access to a phone. He didn't want to leave Buddy home. It was too far out from town. He didn't want to risk those things following him. Chris rubbed Buddy's head, telling him to stay put. His body maintained itself until he got to the hospital. The worker behind the desk saw him stumble in, along with the now blood-soaked bandages he haphazardly applied. Now in safe hands, Chris collapsed. Slowly, Chris's eyes opened. His body was still sore, but not in the same pain he had been in. He moved his head, seeing the hospital room around him, and various bags of liquid connected to his arm. Noticeably, a blood bag. He lost more fluid than he thought. Chris was able to borrow a phone, having Buddy picked up from the truck. After that, he notified the police of the body he had come across. It took the town by surprise. There hadn't been a hunting-related accident in years. It seemed that in their town, death only came from old age or illness. After Michael's body was recovered and examined, it was determined that he had died from wounds inflicted by a large animal. Chris was seen as a lucky survivor, his injuries aligning with the idea of an attack from a bear or a mountain lion. Chris knew from the head dissolving, the rest of the body had too. No point in trying to convince the authorities of what he had seen. Steve took the hit hard, but eventually returned to a sense of normalcy, never letting bad times keep him down for long. A few months after the incident, Chris moved closer into town, not partaking in his survival expeditions anymore. Nobody said anything at the time, but they knew Chris had changed. Some years later, a young hunter spotted Chris at the local bar. His double shot of whiskey sat untouched before him, his vacant stare reflecting back at him through the drink. The young hunter was perplexed. He had heard disjointed rumors of what happened, but wanted to get the story from the source. The hunter hesitantly sat down at the bar next to Chris, looking at the glass, then to him. Silence hung for a moment before he finally broke it with a question, asking Chris what occurred that night. The answer took a moment to come out. Finally, Chris spoke. The Bears were desperate that year.